So I thought it was time for another history lesson, not a history lesson about Wichita Falls, but how your wallet got here. I'm going to do a 3-part series on how you understand why we are where we are right now. And I am not a political pundit. I've just lived through decades. And I wanted to share with you how critically important it is to understand how money works, number one, but how it's made a shift over the last 50 years. Because that's really what's so critically important, to understand how we got here and how we're going to get to a different place, whatever that place looks like. So I'm going to start with, picture this. It's 1973. Gas was 40 cents a gallon. A new house cost around $32,000. $32,000. I could go buy a bunch of them right now. And I had just personally, in 1973, just graduated from high school. What happened next would change the American economy forever. So let's go back all the way to 1973, because the fact of the matter is that things started to change and we have let this train, this runaway train, get out of control. But I want to explain to you why that is in a very simple, congruent way. Your wallet today is reflective of all those things. So the very first thing that I want to talk about, and I used to hear this all the time when I was a kid growing up. My mom was very political. And she talked about the gold standard. Well, when I'm a kid, I'm in 1973, I'm 18 years old. What the hell do I know about the gold standard? But here's the thing. It's really important to understand what that means to you and how we got to where we are today. But before we dive into what happened in the 70s, let's understand what money actually was before 1971. All right, so I just told you where I was at 1973. This happened when I was 16 years old. So, you know, you might be 18, 20, 30 right now going, this is history. This is ancient history. It really isn't. It's impacting your life right now. But before 1971, for decades, every dollar in your pocket, like, you know, take out a dollar bill or $100 bill. It was backed by actual gold in Fort Knox. You could literally walk into a bank and exchange your dollars for gold because the value was based on what gold was. And then also when countries traded with each other, they used dollars because the United States has always been the gold standard, if you will, of money. So people would use dollars because they knew those dollars were as good as gold. Now, no, not at all. But by 1971, things were about to change dramatically. So here I am, literally at 1971, 16 years old. It's the first disagreeable conversation that I had with my mother, who is a very staunch Republican, right? President Nixon was in the White House. I was learning in school about the potential impeachment and coming home and being chastised by my mother about disagreeing with the president. But the fact of the matter is that I didn't do it in a crazy way. I just said, I think that's a problem. But President Nixon made a decision that would reshape our entire economic system. Are you ready? He ended the gold standard. Now, let me tell you something. There was a lot of things that Richard Nixon did that were probably not great for the country. And I'm not saying that he didn't do good, because here's the thing, is that there's always good and there's always bad. There's just not one basis of evil, even though people are promoting things like that right now. Now, instead of being backed by gold, our dollars would be backed by trust. I'm sorry, that cracks me up. Trust in what? Trust in the US government and its economy. First of all, had you said that to me today, I would have laughed even louder. But the problem is that it was backed by the trust of the US government. Okay. So here's the thing, is that we had this money supply, right? Money, little paper money, little coins, and they're backed by gold. Well, all of a sudden now, the modern money instead of being backed by gold, is backed by the US government. How is that possible? Here's where the things got really interesting. Once we weren't limited by gold, right? So the amount of money in the US Treasury system was only as much as the gold that we had to support it. Well, when you take away the gold standard, the amount of money in our economy could grow much faster. Sounds like a good thing, right? Let's break this down, what I'm calling the M2 money supply. It's not just the cash in your wallet, because in 1973, our total M2 money supply was 653 billion. Like we're talking about trillions right now. But it was this was the whole bit of money that was in the economy, right? This is hilarious. So think about this. In 1973, $653 billion were floating around out there. That was all the cash that we had in the country. 653 billion. That's what Doge is finding to cut out of the system. This includes cash in circulation, right? Checking accounts, savings accounts, money market accounts. This is all the cash. Even though it wasn't really digital quite at that point. But the fact is that we had 600 some odd billion dollars for all the money. All the money. Well, clearly, if that's all the money in the whole country, the budget is a whole lot different. So we're going to get to that. From 1973 to 1983, this is what happened. That number more than doubled to $1.6 trillion. But how does this money get created? Here's the kicker, is that when you start printing money, it's like monopoly money. This is the problem. People literally, I don't think, grasp the concept, number one, of inflation, of printing money. You can't just make money out of thin air. You cannot. We do, but it has a consequence. It's not just about printing these bills. When the Federal Reserve wants to increase the money supply, they don't just print bills, right? They have this process that they use. They buy government bonds. So anybody has ever, I've talked about the bond market extensively on this channel because it has direct relationship to interest rates. But what happens is the government is buying these bonds, what then puts new money, because they're buying it from the banks. They're putting new money into the banking system. Banks then lend this money out multiple times through a process called fractional reserve banking. Okay, I don't want to get really into the weeds here, but the fact of the matter is that the banks are not supposed to be lending more than a certain percentage of what they actually have on hand, which now this money is fake. So it's very interesting that we just started to create this very unstable economy way back in the 70s because we went off the gold standard. So what does that mean for you today, but also how did it get to be the way that it is today? That's what I want to talk to you about. Because from 1973 to today, holy guacamole, the numbers are insane. They're insane. And we've talked about inflation. Everybody hears this word inflation. I don't know that everybody really understands exactly what inflation is. So here's where this hits your wallet. As more money entered the system, so this has been going on for decades. Every time more money enters the system, each dollar that you have, we've had the same exact piece of paper called a $100 bill. We've had the exact same piece of paper, but guess what? It buys less. Have you noticed? Right? So we say that prices have gone up, but the reality is that your dollar and the valuation of our dollar has gone down. It doesn't buy as much. Let's look at a typical shopping cart from 1973. I think this is hilarious because in 1973, I was a teenager just getting out into the world. My first job, they told me I could get $500 a month. I thought I was going to be a millionaire in 2 days. But so these items that we had back in there, this is a typical shopping cart. A gallon of milk, $1.31. A dozen eggs. Okay, compared with $9 today was 78 cents, right? So my dollar bought more in 1973 than it does now. It's not talking about the prices because I'm talking about how inflation works. But a pound of coffee, 95 cents. God. You go down to Starbucks and it's $10 to have a cup of coffee. But here's the thing. Inflation isn't just about prices going up. It affects your savings. So your money, if you're saving and you're retiring and you're putting money in 40 years ago, that same money doesn't buy the same that it did 40 years ago. So you're actually not getting the same bang for your buck every time we print money and create inflation. It affects your salary. You may be making the same amount of money you did 2 years ago, but it's not going as far, right? It affects your retirement plans. It affects the value of your home. So your home, fortunately, real estate has only gone up in value over all of these years. So that's a good thing. You bought a home 20, 40 years ago, you're in like Flint. Nowadays, it's really hard to buy a house it's affordable, except for in Wichita Falls. But here's the thing. We're going to couple this with government spending. How is that even connected? Here's where the government spending enters the picture, or the nightmare. In 1973, the federal budget was, get this, the whole budget for the whole country. What are we at? 36 trillion? Some astronomical number. But back then it was 245 billion. That's one payment by one agency right now. Back in 1973, 245 billion was the budget. In 1983 and 83, in 10 years, it tripled to 808 billion. Why? That's crazy. We didn't triple the amount of people in the United States, right? Why did we need $808 billion to do what the government is supposed to do? Where did this money come from that now, right? If we have a budget of $808 billion and we're depending on the taxpayer to fund that budget, because that's what you're doing, your money that you pay taxes funds the budget. I don't know, some people miss that part sometimes. It's not free money. Where did it come from? It didn't come from the people. They didn't have $808 billion. So we began this process called a deficit. We were not living within our budget 40 years ago. It's just crazy. When the government spends more than it takes in through taxes, right? So if we're taking in 400 billion and we're spending 800 billion, we're at a deficit of 400 billion. Where does that money come from? Well, it doesn't. Just like your household. If you spend more money than you have that you're taking in, you go mortgage your house, you finance your car, you finance your groceries, you finance your television, you finance your furniture, all of that stuff then becomes debt. And it's exactly the same way with the government. It has to borrow money. This can lead to more money being created. So in the beginning, we weren't borrowing from other countries like we are with China right now. But the fact of the matter is the government was upside down. That then fuels inflation because the government, what did they do? They were borrowing money from themselves, right? That's an unsustainable model, I can assure you. So here they are borrowing money, right, from themselves, printing money, because when you print money, you're buying bonds. That's really the thing, is you're not just printing out money, but it's going to fuel inflation. So what happens when you have inflation? It just means the economy is heating up, meaning heating up means prices are going up and the valuation of the dollar is going down. And when we call that heating up, you can call it the economy's thermostat. It was on fire! Here's the thing, enter the Fed. Think of interest rates as the economy's thermostat. When inflation heats up, the Federal Reserve raises interest rates to cool things down. Y'all have experienced that in the last 2 years. The Fed has gone crazy. But let me explain to you, when you've been on the planet for as long as I have, that what we've been through is nothing. Nothing. They raised the rates to cool things down. That's why we saw mortgage rates back then in the 80s soar, get this, to 16.64%. What? Yes, I was selling loans back then. It was crazy. But here's the thing, is that if you went from around 7% interest rates to 16%, we're bitching and moaning when they went from 4 to 7. That's 3%. This was from 7 to 16. That's double. These payments on different loans, let's say back then you bought a $50,000 house and your interest at 7% would give you a $332 a month payment. Now, we'd all love that. But at 16%, it was $703. That's just the principal and interest payment. Doesn't count taxes and insurance. That's double. So if you were looking for a house back then and interest rates are 16%, you really got thrown out of the market completely. So the problem becomes right away is we went off of the gold standard, we started printing money, inflation went rapid, and then the Fed took over and started raising the interest rates. Let's come back to today. The 1970s weren't just the decade of disco. They were when America fundamentally changed how its money worked. And understanding this period helps us make sense of our current economy today. Because if you don't understand how we got here, you sure the hell don't know how to fix the problem. I guarantee you. I have some ideas. There's some stuff going on that some people are upset about, some people aren't. It doesn't matter. I'm going to talk about what's coming up next. Next time, I'm going to explore the 80s. Because when America would face the consequences of these changes, of these interest rates, well, first of all, of this rapid inflation, then these interest rates, I can tell you, we have a history to look at. But also, there's been mistakes that we've made in that history that we need to stop making and move forward in a way that creates the prosperity that we all deserve. Stay tuned for our second episode coming up next week.